When the Mafia needs to eliminate a target in the year 2074, they send them back in time where an assassin is ready and waiting. These hired guns, like Joe, carry out their missions without hesitation. However, one day, Joe discovers that the mob intends to send his future self back in time for him to be assassinated, effectively closing the loop. Welcome to Recap Planet. Spoilers ahead, so be prepared. Crime bosses in the future resort to time travel to send their targets into the past. Victims are tied up, bagged, thrown into the time machine, and transported back to 2044, where they are immediately shot dead by hired contract killers known as loopers. Loopers then receive payment through the bars of silver attached to their victims' backs. Joseph Joe Simmons is a 25-year-old looper who works for a mafia company in Kansas City. Joe's boss, Abe, manages the loopers and owns a club where Joe spends time with Susie, a showgirl. To make things more interesting, Abe has also hired muscle in the present day to help him run a criminal empire. These men are known as the Gat Men, led by a guy named Kid Blue. Gat Men are named after their Magnum revolvers, which have greater range and accuracy than the loopers' blunderbusses, short-range shotguns designed strictly for close quarters. While at the club one night, another looper announces that he has just closed his loop. The big payoff in gold is reason enough to celebrate. As Joe continues his work, he and the other loopers begin to notice that loops are being closed at an increasing pace. One night, Seth, Joe's friend, and fellow looper visit him in a panic, claiming that he failed to close his loop as he was supposed to. Seth confesses that when his older self appeared, he was singing a song his mother had sung to him when he was a baby, and he couldn't bring himself to kill him. However, old Seth told him that a new crime boss called the Rainmaker has started a reign of terror in the future and is now closing all the loops. Before Seth can reveal more, the Gat Men arrive, forcing Joe to hide Seth in his apartment floor safe. The Gat Men suspect Joe is harboring Seth, so they take him to Abe. Abe strikes a deal with Joe. If he gives up Seth, he will be released. If he doesn't, they cannot kill Joe because it could upset things in the future, but they can make things difficult for him by taking half of the silver they know he's been saving up for his retirement in France. Joe gives up Seth immediately. Abe suggests Joe go to China instead of France, saying, "I'm from the future. You should go to China." Joe is let go and given a free lap dance with Susie while Abe orders Kid Blue to call the doc so they can take revenge on Seth. Old Seth tries to climb a barbed wire fence, but he sees old scars appear on his arm, spelling out words that instruct him to go to an address. Despite ignoring this, his right pinky finger disappears, followed shortly by his ring and middle fingers. The stubs are not bloody, as if the digits were removed many years ago. Then, the tip of his nose is cut off. In a frantic state, old Seth returns to his car and drives to the address he was given. However, just as he arrives, he loses his right foot, causing him to lose control of the car and crash. He desperately limps towards the address but both of his legs disappear, and he falls to the ground and crawls the rest of the way to the door. He bangs on the door, and Kid Blue opens it and shoots him dead. The remains of old Seth are carried inside while young Seth, who is being operated on and having his body parts removed, is seen hooked up to a ventilator, which will keep him alive for the next 30 years. Joe continues to carry out his killings, but after each one, he goes to a diner to work on his French lessons. There, he is served by a waitress named Beatrix. However, he is puzzled when his next victim is late, and when the person finally shows up, Joe is shocked to discover that it is his older self. After a brief stare down, Joe tries to shoot him, but old Joe spins around and uses the gold strap to his back to deflect the bullet. He then knocks young Joe out with a punch. After Joe regains consciousness, he finds a note telling him to get out of town. However, he decides to return to his apartment, where he finds the Gat Men searching it and removing his silver. Joe manages to trap Kid Blue in his floor safe, but he is winged by another Gat Man and falls from his fire escape, landing unconscious on a car parked below. At this point, the movie pauses to show the timeline that old Joe comes from. After closing his loop, Joe moves to Shanghai, as advised by Abe. However, he blows through his funds within 10 years due to heavy drug usage and partying. By 2054, he becomes a contract killer for local crime gangs, and over the next 13 years, his hair falls out, leaving him mostly bald. In 2067, he meets a caring woman who helps him get sober, and they marry 2 years later. Things are relatively peaceful for the next 3 years until 2074. One morning, a news report is discussing a terrorist attack by a man known as the Rainmaker. Meanwhile, 3 men wearing wide-brimmed hats break into Joe's house, kidnap him, and set his house on fire. Their intention is to take Joe to the time machine so that they can send him back in time to close his loop. However, Joe manages to slip out of the zip ties they used to restrain him, gets his hood off, and kills his attackers. He then jumps into the time machine to travel back in time. From old Joe's perspective, we see that he had previously knocked young Joe out, stole his truck, got some supplies and clothing from a drugstore, and went to young Joe's apartment. There, he witnessed young Joe fall from the balcony, rescued him, and killed the Gat man who was shooting at young Joe. Old Joe goes to the library and finds some cryptic numbers. Suddenly, letters begin to form on his arm, spelling out Beatrix. It's a message from young Joe to meet him at the diner. They order the same meals, and old Joe asks Joe how his French lessons are going. He then speaks in French and tells young Joe that he knows he has a gun under the table pointed at him. Old Joe explains that he's glad he learned the language and reveals more information about the Rainmaker. The Rainmaker appeared out of nowhere, took control of all the major crime syndicates within 6 months, and ordered the closing of all loops. Old Joe's wife was accidentally killed by the syndicate men when old Joe was captured. Old Dale, one of Joe's looper colleagues, gave old Joe a numerical sequence that could lead to finding the Rainmaker's identity. Old Joe knows that the Rainmaker is living in the same county, and if he can kill him, his wife would still be alive. Old Joe and young Joe get into a scuffle when old Joe realizes that young Joe still plans to kill him. However, they both notice that the diner has cleared out, and the staff and customers have disappeared. They realize they're about to be attacked and suddenly, Gat men burst in and ambush them. Old Joe gives Joe a piece of a map with an address marked and a string of digits, telling him that the Rainmaker may live there. Young Joe and old Joe both run off, with the Gat men chasing after them and shooting at them. Young Joe is being chased by some people, but he manages to escape and finds himself at a farmhouse owned by a woman named Sarah. Sarah lives there with her son Sid Harrington. Joe shows Sarah a map with some coordinates, which she recognizes as Sid's birth date and the serial number of the hospital where he was born. This prompts Joe to explain the situation about the Rainmaker. Sarah reveals that she knows a lot about loopers and how they operate. Old Joe used a database with a string of digits to find 3 possible children born on the same day in the same hospital, and he intends to kill them. Sarah warns Sid to stay away from Joe, but Sid is curious and befriends Joe. Sid shows Joe some of the electronics he is playing with, and he builds transmitters so that Joe and Sarah can signal each other. Joe is impressed with the advanced work that the 5-year-old is doing. Old Joe tracks down one of the potential Rainmaker children who is heading to a birthday party. He kills him, but when he realizes he is still existing in his past, he breaks down crying. He has killed the wrong child. He then heads to the other child's place but is hesitant when he realizes it's where Susie, his old flame from 30 years earlier, is living with her son. Instead of killing the child right away, he watches their apartment. As young Joe and Sarah become close, he learns that she is a TK with slightly more power than the other TKs and that Sid was raised by Sarah's sister for 2 years until she was somehow killed. Sid thinks Sarah's sister was his mother, and he does not believe that Sarah is his real mother. Sarah is scared of Sid and runs to her room and hides in a safe when Sid gets angry at her because he thinks she's lying about being his mother. One day, Jesse, one of the Gat men, comes looking for Joe. Sid helps him escape, and Jesse leaves. While Sid and Joe are alone hiding from Jesse, Joe tells him how his own mother gave him to the panhandlers, so he grew up without her. A moment later, Joe says that she sold him and that she used drugs. Being motherless led Joe to become a killer, a drug user, and in time, a looper. Jesse is suspicious of Sarah and returns, holding Sarah at gunpoint when Joe comes down the stairs. As Joe tries to reason with Jesse, Sid starts to come down the stairs. Startled by Jesse, Sid falls down the stairs and goes into a rage. He lets out a massive telekinetic blast, killing Jesse. Jesse's blood rains out of his chest, implying how the Rainmaker's name was coined. Sid's extraordinary telekinetic abilities confirm to Joe that Sid is the Rainmaker and that Sarah's sister was killed by Sid when he lost control of his powers. Joe finds Sid in the sugarcane fields, crying, and comforts him. Sarah helps Joe realize that this boy needs love and may not turn into the Rainmaker if he is raised in a loving home. Kid Blue has located old Joe at Susie's apartment and captures him when he attempts to break in to kill the child. Young Joe warns Sarah and Sid to escape, believing that his employers or old Joe will target the farm. Old Joe breaks free and kills Abe and all the Gat men, except for Kid Blue, who is shot in the foot. As the two Joes face off near Sarah's house, Kid Blue attacks and is killed by young Joe. Sarah and Sid try to flee, but old Joe fires at their truck. Sid wants Sarah to stop, but she accelerates in an attempt to run over old Joe. Sid uses his TK powers to flip the truck, and they both run into the sugarcane fields to hide. Old Joe shoots at them, grazing Sid's cheek. Sid uses his TK powers to suspend Sarah and Old Joe in the air. Young Joe is following Old Joe in his truck, but the TK blast knocks it over. Sarah calms Sid, who calls her mom for the first time, showing Joe that Sid can be controlled. Old Joe recovers and attempts to shoot Sid, but Sarah shields him. Time flashes for young Joe, who realizes the cycle of revenge is in a loop. He imagines Old Joe shooting Sarah through the heart, and Sid sees his mother die before escaping on a passing train. Young Joe understands that even if he kills Old Joe, the loop will not be closed, and Old Joe will keep returning. He decides to change it and shoots himself, closing the loop circuit. Old Joe disappears instantly. After bandaging Sid's face, Sarah notices the ground around the overturned truck is covered in gold bars Old Joe stole from Abe's headquarters. She and Sid will be well provided for. She goes to young Joe's body lying in the field and strokes his hair, as his mother used to do for him. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment and let us know which film you want us to explore next. Take care.